Hello, and welcome back to the H-Span podcast, your go-to podcast for longevity policy discussion. I'm your host, Dylan Livingston. Today, we are joined by Andrew Steele. Andrew is a physicist turned biologist who made the switch after determining that aging was the single most important scientific challenge of our time, in quotes. In this episode, I wanted to find out how Andrew first got involved with the longevity movement, as well as his thoughts on the current state of longevity research, government interaction, and the future of this field. So join us as we discuss the role policymaking plays in the advancement of aging biology. Without further ado, here's Andrew Steele.
Live long and prosper.
Well, first, Andrew, I want to thank you for joining us for this iteration of the H-Span podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time and your voice and your efforts in this aging problem that we're all, trying to solve. So for our audience, which is mostly US based, we are a US based political advocacy organization, A4LI. Our audience may or may not be familiar with you, but being that you are a star in the UK, I want you to introduce yourself. So can you take a second to just tell our listeners who you are, what you're up to, a little background?
So I guess, hi, I'm Andrew Steele. I am a physicist turned biologist. So what happened was back at the end of my physics PhD in about 2011 or so, I decided that aging was the single biggest humanitarian scientific challenge of our time because it's responsible for so many deaths, as the A4LI has eloquently explained in lots of its publications. And I decided that I wanted to switch to biology to sort of understand if this was as promising an area as it sounded. And what I found was that after that period of time working in biology, I worked as what's called a computational biologist for about 5 years. I found that, the public doesn't know that much about aging. Often policymakers don't know a huge amount about aging because they've got loads and loads of other things on. They're busy policymaking lives. They're busy just, everyday lives. But I also found that scientists don't necessarily know a great deal about aging because often, your standard biology or biochemistry or whatever it might be, or even your medical undergraduate degree, there's often not a single lecture on aging biology. And so I just decided what we really needed was to spread the word about this incredible field and the huge potential that it has. So I ended up switching from science into a more sort of communications role, and I became an author. I've written a book called Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. So if you want an introduction to the biology of aging, I've tried to give the sort of most comprehensive overview of the science in an accessible way as I could in that. And at the moment, I'm working on my next book. I'm trying to do a bit of TV with Ageless to try and spread the word as widely as possible, making a few YouTube videos about longevity and a bunch of other science topics that I care about. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to define exactly what I do, but trying to sort of advocate for aging is a huge part of it.
Absolutely. And you and I both are advocates, but you are really not knowledgeable. You're an expert in the science. And so, that's why I appreciate what you do so much, because you really are a credible voice. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not, but I'm, a politico through and through, and right. And I think about the political ramifications of this aging biotech endeavor and the whole longevity crusade, right? And I'm trying to think about it from a policy perspective. But you really can are one of the great communicators this field has, and so I want to just say that right now. I appreciate what you do, and I'm sure do you miss academia at all, or the lifestyle of a scientist researcher? Like, do you miss that at all, or are you happy in this new communications role?
I'm actually very happy doing this, and I think it depends how you approach the communication stuff. Sort of behind all of the work that I do is, I hope I bring some of that academic rigor to, all of the sort of books and the videos and whatever it is that I produce. And that's because, there are hundreds of references in the back of Ageless, all, the scientific papers that I've read during the course of writing the book. I also do a lot of my own sort of data and calculations because often there are sort of gaps in the literature for things that I want to talk about. So I think, I can still sort of scratch that methodological itch and really get my sort of hands dirty doing something that's a little bit scientific. But there's also just this huge privilege that comes with communicating science. When you're writing a book, I was able to write to some of the absolute top experts in this huge range of different parts of the aging field and just get a one-to-one sit down with them, which is absolutely incredible. And I think it's given me an understanding of aging biology that would have taken me decades working in the field, but because I was able to sit down with all these experts, read all of these papers across so much more of a diverse range than you get when you are down in the trenches in science working, sort of chipping away at your one highly specific problem. I really loved, talking about science and the sort of access and the broad overview that it gives me.
Right. Absolutely. It's interesting. The scientists in the longevity industry, I don't know, I can't speak in any other field really, but they are all very open and honest about, what they're trying to do, the feasibility of it, and, the timeline, all these kind of, things that, I mean, I don't know if you saw the recent BBC Brian Johnson piece, but yeah, her big takeaway was, I'm forgetting her name, I think Lara Lewington. Her big takeaway was that, the longevity industry was a bunch of rational thinkers trying to help people, live in better health, for longer, not this kind of, moonshot, live forever type of thing that people kind of get the impression of for billionaires or whatever we want to, kind of go into there. But so my point in all that is, yeah, I also feel a very similar way with, A4LI being, the political advocacy organization it is. Everybody has been so, kind of willing to sit down and not only explain the science, but also get involved politically and on my end. So yeah, no, it's a small but growing and mighty field, and so you're at the center of it all, Andrew. So I'm glad that we're working together on this, though, because your voice is needed on this political advocacy side, right? And it's going to be more needed as we continue to ramp up efforts.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. And also, it's just a huge privilege to be in this position because I have been able to speak to all these scientists. I have been able to build up this knowledge base. Right. And also, I wrote the book partly as a piece of policy advocacy. Obviously, that isn't the primary function. I want to sort of get the word out there to as many people as possible, from scientists to, just people on the street. But actually, the crucial thing that this field really needs is sort of the recognition from the people in government, from people who are, making science policy, funding this stuff and making sure that it can achieve the huge potential that it has, because it's a really difficult balancing act communicating this stuff. There's some amazing, exciting developments happening. There's new papers coming out every day, every week. There's this sort of, almost fire hose of new research about aging biology. But at the same time, as that, communicating that excitement, that vibrancy in the field, we have to communicate that it's just not enough. If we're going to really achieve the potential that this field has, the funding is just, honestly, a bit paltry at the moment. And if we really gave it the sort of funding that it deserved, the funding that we could provide it, then, it could change all of our lives for the better.
Absolutely. It sounds like you would be great sitting in on an A4LI meeting with one of these political offices. You definitely, that's basically what we say, all the time, right? Yeah, and I'm sure you can kind of get into the statistics more, but 70% of deaths are daily are driven by aging or age-related diseases or some sort of age-related ailment, right? And we only put in the NIH, we only put less than 1% of our budget towards this field of research. So, it's a complete mismatch, and, we'll kind of, let's go into that a little bit. So the first thing I kind of wanted to discuss with you is your thoughts on where longevity is now, because there's a lot of, I see people being overhyped about the field to a certain extent, and then I see people being underhyped about the field, people thinking that, we're not actually that close, but then also people thinking we're, about to be immortal forever. So can you, as someone who talks to so many people, right, has this kind of ear to so many doors in the longevity field, knows all the top scientists and researchers and what have you, could you give your assessment on, where we are on the science, specifically what science is, looking the most promising these days to you as someone who is so much an expert in this field? And, can you just kind of give our audience kind of, a sensible overview of what's going on in the field right now and what you're excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the field is in a place where it's been sort of building up to this position for the last few decades. And if you roll back to the 1990s, which I think is where the excitement about all this really started, for a very long time before the 90s, people thought aging was just this impossibly complicated process. It's just a sort of way in which our bodies decay in, hundreds, maybe thousands of different ways. And this just isn't something that can be sensibly studied in the lab. This isn't something that we can intervene in particularly. But what happened in the 1990s was that we discovered that there are single genetic changes, in fact, sometimes a single letter of DNA that can be changed inside. And actually what they were looking at the time were these things called nematode worms, these tiny sort of few millimeter long worms that crawl around on these Petri dishes. And they found by making a single letter change to that worm's DNA, they could actually double its lifespan. And suddenly that's far more exciting. So that the first reason is obviously, doubling lifespan, that's going to grab some headlines. But more importantly, from a scientific point of view, that meant that you could make these sort of genetic changes, something you can do in the lab, not some impossibly complicated cocktail of drugs or interventions. We can actually start to, do relatively relatively simple genetic changes, and then we could see what happens. And we could find out, what's different in this worm that's aging twice as slowly, apparently, as one of its compatriots that hasn't got this genetic mutation. And that really opened up the field. Firstly, I think it brought a sort of influx of excitement and science, but also it opened it up to this laboratory exploration. And now, a few decades later, we're at the point where we've got a fairly good handle. You're not going to get complete agreement among scientists, but I think that's probably true in any scientific field. But we think there is this collection of changes, sort of dubbed the hallmarks of the aging process. And I've got 10 of these in my book. There were 9 in the original paper that introduced the idea. There are now 12 because I actually released a paper in the last few months, adding a couple of extra ones. There was a collection of 7 thought of in the early 2000s. So, people do disagree about the exact number and the exact categorization, but there's a huge amount of overlap in these different categorization systems. So we've got some idea of things that change with age and seem to accelerate the aging process if they're sped up and decelerate the aging process if they're slowed down. Now, that might sound super abstract, so let's try and make that a little bit more concrete. My favorite example of this is something that's actually quite hot at the moment, which is something called the accumulation of senescent cells. Now, senescent is just the biological term for old, basically. It's just, the technical term. And what we find is that these particular type of cells, they don't divide, which means they're no longer sort of fulfilling their function in the body. And these were first observed in addition in the lab, but we then realized that these cells actually accumulate in all of our bodies as we get older, and not just our bodies, but the bodies of other animals as well, things like mice. And so these things, as they accumulate, they seem to accelerate not just one disease as part of the aging process, but perhaps even all of the diseases of the aging process, certainly a large number. So diseases from cancer to heart disease to dementia, a lot of these things are connected with this phenomenon of cellular senescence. So that's sort of step one of, doing something about aging biology, is identifying these changes. So seeing something that might accumulate with age, it might decrease with age, it just changes in a certain specific way as we get older. But then the next step is to identify an intervention, a drug or another kind of treatment that can do something about this change. And so back in sort of 2011 or so, scientists developed this genetic way of removing senescent cells. And then a few years later, they developed a drug which they could use. In fact, it was a combination of drugs. They found that dasatinib, which is a chemo drug, and quercetin, which is this flavanol that's often found in various kinds of fruit and veg, when combined, could be given to mice, and it would kill the senescent cells in these mice, but leave the rest of the cells of their body intact. And what was really exciting about this was that basically it made the mice biologically younger. So it made them live a bit longer, which I guess is sort of prerequisite for doing something about aging. But it wasn't just that they were dragging out that period of frailty at the end of life. The mice were living healthier. They got less cancer. They got less heart disease. They got fewer cataracts clouding their eyes. They were able to run further and faster on the tiny mouse-sized treadmills that using these experiments, which is sort of a mouse way of experimenting with the delaying of frailty, which is obviously something that affects humans a huge amount as we get older. It seemed to reduce some of the cognitive decline associated with mouse aging. And honestly, if you haven't seen pictures of the mice that have had these senolytic treatments, as they're called, you should go on, have a look on the internet for them right now, because even to a completely non-expert eye, when I was a biologist, I was a computational person. I was mainly sat, tapping away at my keyboard programming all day. I never worked with mice in the lab, but even to my very non-expert eye, it's obvious which mouse has had the drugs. They've got thicker fur, they've got less gray fur, they've got plumper skin, they're not so fat looking. They just look healthier. It's absolutely obvious which mouse is which. And what this suggests is that these senescent cells, they accumulate in our bodies, and they aren't just driving one part of aging. They aren't just driving one disease. They're driving many of the diseases, maybe all of them. They're driving the cosmetic changes, the skin, the fur, that kind of stuff, the cognitive changes, all of these different things linked together by an understanding of the aging biology. And we're now at a point where there are 20 or 30 companies trying to turn these ideas from something that works in mice to something that works in people. And so this really shows you how you can go from understanding a hallmark, a change associated with aging, and turn it into, hopefully a commercializable medicine that we can be taking to slow down our own aging at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the one public company that comes to mind, I think, that just hit my inbox today was Unity Biotech. I think somewhere in phase 2 trials now. So yeah, it's exciting times for sure on the senolytics front. Can you kind of touch on some of those other hallmarks of aging for our audience? And you don't need to go into, you can give as much or as little explanation as you want, but I think it would be useful for everybody to kind of get an idea of what the other ones at least entail, or are talking about within the cell, right? Because these are all changes that happen within your cells. So maybe somebody can think back to, some of our audience can think back to their 9th grade biology class and, remember some of the pieces of the cell, and, hopefully this explanation can be useful. But Andrew, can you kind of touch on those other hallmarks that happen as we age?
Yeah, sure. So the senescent cells probably fall somewhere in the middle of the hallmarks. The way I lay them out in the book is sort of going from smallest and most fundamental to the biggest and sort of most all-encompassing. So starting at the very smallest and most fundamental level, you'll remember from your high school biology that in the middle of every cell, there's this thing called the nucleus. And inside the cellular nucleus, there's the instruction manual that allows life to proceed, basically. And this instruction manual is written in the code of DNA. And what happens to that DNA as we get older is it accumulates damage and it accumulates mutations. And that damage, those damage and mutations are caused by a variety of different things. Some of it is things like ultraviolet lights. If you go out on a sunny day and you're not wearing sunscreen, the UV light can damage the DNA in your skin cells. Some of it's caused by toxins or things in our diet and that kind of stuff. But an awful lot of it actually is caused just by the rough and tumble of being inside a cell, existing, living, because there are all kinds of chemicals that are buzzing around, allowing our metabolism to work, which can damage the DNA and cause these mutations, which are changes to the letters of the DNA, changes to that genetic code. And you can imagine if there are mistakes, if there are typos in the instruction manual for life, then problems can ensue. And one of the most obvious one of those problems is cancer. We know that if you give the cell the wrong combination of mutations, it can learn to divide uncontrollably. And that uncontrollable division can ultimately go on to cause a tumor, which can obviously has all the consequences that we know about cancer. It can go on to kill you. So that's at the very, very smallest level, changes to our DNA. Sort of zooming out a bit further, you can think about changes to telomeres. That's something people have often heard of. These are the protective caps at the end of our DNA that get shorter as we go through our lives. And we see that people with shorter telomeres tend to have worse health outcomes as they get older. So that's something we could think about, trying to intervene in. Another component inside the cell that people might have heard of is the mitochondrion, often known as the powerhouse of the cell. That's a sort of cliche, to the point where it's even cliche to point out that it's a cliche, frankly, but it's something that you might have heard in your high school biology textbook. And we know that these change in their behavior. They can actually acquire mutations of their own as we go through our lives. Then all of these sort of small scale problems going on inside the cell can cause cells to become senescent. So we've already touched a bit upon that. And then zooming out even further, some of the hallmarks are actually for sort of systems in the body. And the final hallmark that I talk about in the book is the aging of the immune system. And this can be caused by a variety of different sort of hallmarks that precede it almost. So if you imagine some of the immune cells becoming senescent, they stop fulfilling their immune function. And the obvious consequence of this is that we get much worse at fighting infections as we get older. So if we think about, back to the COVID-19 pandemic not so long ago, we noticed that older people were much, much more likely, still are much, much more likely, even after vaccination, to get serious consequences, to go to hospital, to die of coronavirus than a younger person. And that's partly because of the aging of our immune systems. But it also has a much wider sort of impact on our biology. We know that the immune system is partly responsible for the sort of processes behind heart disease, cardiovascular disease, strokes, these sorts of things. And we also know that the reduced surveillance by the immune system isn't just bad at spotting, or doesn't just worsen at spotting external threats like COVID, but also gets worse at spotting the internal threats, so things like cancer. And so, if a cell does accumulate that wrong combination of mutations in a young person, the immune system might spot it and clear it out before it ever becomes a problem. But in an older person, those cells can be sort of left unmolested to grow, and that can cause a problem. And this really illustrates how these hallmarks are connected together. So it's not just the mutations that cause the cancer. It's the fact that those mutations can occur in an older environment that's changed in all kinds of different ways. And that can encourage, the cancer to become a serious problem. And so these hallmarks, they encompass, basically every aspect of our biology, and they're interlinked in various ways. But the idea is that by going after specific ones of these hallmarks, you can hit not just one age-related disease, but many diseases simultaneously, again, like with the senescent cells.
That was an excellent explanation. Thank you for that, Andrew. So let me jump on a thought that I just had while you were speaking about that. So, we one of the things that I get asked about a lot is what do these therapies actually look like, right? Are we going to be, is it one pill? Are we going to be taking one pill that's going to cure all of this? Is it going to be a senolytic and a mitochondria repair therapy and this, that, and the other thing, right? Or is it going to be, in combination with each other? Are there going to be a lot of different senolytic drugs available? Will they target different things? But, that might be too broad of a question, but more in the most general sense, like what are these, what are these therapies going to actually look like in the future? Are we going to be taking pills? Or is it injections? Are they going to be in combination with each other? What do you think the whole kind of therapeutics field will look like once, let's say, aging drugs are proven to work in humans and are available commercially?
I mean, I think the honest answer is we're going to have to wait and see, because we're going to have to see what works and what works in combination. But it's going to fall into, it's basically going to, I think, cover, a huge amount of what we understand by modern medicine, and maybe some more things on top of that. So there are certainly going to be pills. I think pharma companies are really used to finding a particular what's called a target in medicine, and then designing a drug to go in and hit that target. And so the first senolytics may well be drugs, because that's something that pharmaceutical companies are very used to developing. But then there's also this whole range of other ways in which we can intervene in our biology. There's things like antibodies, which might be another good way to get rid of senescent cells, or there's even the potential to use vaccines to train our immune system to get more effective at clearing those cells up. So there's a whole variety of approaches there. Then I think looking a little bit further into the future, we're going to see the advent of gene therapies to treat aging, because we know that there are certain genetic variants that are much more common in people who make it to older ages. There are some genetic variants that are associated with particular diseases. And, we might want to go in and alter our DNA to change those to be these more favorable variants in everybody in the population. And I think that's a hugely exciting idea. And it might not be so far off, because I think often, when I talk about gene therapy, that can sound quite sci-fi, the idea of going in and changing our DNA. But actually, we've already got the first gene therapies, that are approved in clinical use right now. There have been a couple approved, in fact, earlier this year. And at the moment, they're for specific diseases where we know that a single gene goes wrong. So something like, there's a disease called sickle cell anemia, where people, their blood cells form this sort of sickle shape. They're less able to carry oxygen. And we've now got an approved gene therapy. This is a very serious disease with no particularly effective treatments until this gene therapy came along, that can go in and fix the genetic problem that causes those blood cells to be that shape and massively improve the quality of life for sufferers. Now, that's sort of a very good sort of testing ground for how gene therapy works, because this is a really serious disease. There aren't many great treatment options. And because gene therapy is very new, we don't want to be handing this out like candy to everybody in the population just yet. But as we cut our teeth on these severe conditions, we can start to slowly understand the safety, slowly understand how to do these therapies from a technical point of view, make them cheaper and so on. And we can think about widening the net. And there are some really great candidates for genes that we could go in and alter, and hopefully, with fairly minimal side effects, give people much potential for longer life. So that's a really cool and exciting idea. And then as we move further into the future, things like stem cell therapies are going to become really important as well, because a lot of what happens when you age is degeneration of various parts of the body. And by introducing stem cells, we can repopulate places where those cells are being lost. And again, that sounds quite futuristic, but there are already a lot of clinical trials for things like stem cells for Parkinson's, stem cells for age-related forms of blindness. Again, these are serious diseases that don't have many treatment options on the table now. And as we broaden that net, as we understand how the stem cell therapies work, we're going to be able to roll these things out much, much more widely. And I'm very happy actually to talk about a cure for aging. This isn't necessarily because I think it's going to be something that happens soon, but if we look around nature, we can see there are animals that literally don't age. They have a risk of death that doesn't change depending on how long ago they were born. They don't become frail as they get older, at least until the very, very end of life. They can stay, even reproductively active. All aspects of their biology seem to be preserved as they get older. And I think that's something that, whether or not we're going to achieve it in the near term, is what we should be aiming for humans. So I'm happy to talk about this idea of a cure for aging. The problem is that when I do talk about that, you sort of get the impression that might be a single pill that you just pop and suddenly, everyone lives forever. But actually, I think it's going to be a combination of all these different therapies. As we understand more and more about how the therapies work, how the aging process is made up of these interlinked hallmarks, we're going to come up with cleverer and cleverer ways to intervene and gradually, push those risks of death and disease further back into the future. So I don't think it's going to be one magic pill. I think it's going to be a combination, a sort of patchwork of things. And that's why it's so important that we don't put all our eggs in one basket, in a sense. We want to make sure that we're researching all of those hallmarks, because it'll be tragic, if we solve 3 hallmarks, but then we get killed by a 4th or a 5th or a 6th one that we just haven't bothered to address.
Right.
So I think it's really important to imagine a cure for aging is going to be a lot of different things.
What I want to ask really quick is, so, do you see there any, in the case of like personalized medicine, like, do you see, potentially a senolytic and, metformin and a gene therapy for me and stem cells? And like, I know you're saying that, they obviously all serve different functions, but like, do you see, it varying between me and you the same way that, I might not have to take a statin or, cancer drugs when you might have to, and, it's going to differ between individuals, their health right now. Like, do you see personalized medicine playing a role in, what kind of drugs you take that will effectively cure your aging? Or is it, do you think it's going to be kind of like a, one drug will be able to probably fix it for all people or most people?
I think this is probably something that's going to vary, again, depending on the hallmark you're looking at. And we're at a stage now where one of the other frustrating things about aging biology, we know enough to have these exciting treatments, but we don't know enough. For example, we don't know which tissues, so which parts of the body these senescent cells are most important in. And this is true in mice, this is true in people. We also know from the mice experiments, at least, that different senolytic drugs and different senolytic interventions have very different effects in different tissues. So it might be that one day, you go to your senologist. This is obviously a medical discipline that doesn't yet exist. And they do some kind of blood test and they say, well, your senescent cell burden is looking worse in your kidneys. It's not looking so bad in your liver. So we'll give you this particular senolytic intervention that will improve the things, as you require. Whereas, someone else might come up with a completely different, they might have the opposite diagnosis for me. So I do think there's definitely some potential for this to be personalized to some extent. At first, it'll probably be, fairly classic things that just kill senescent cells, sort of bludgeon them all around the body. But as we get more nuanced in our understanding of where those cells are a problem and how they're a problem, I think it probably will vary between individuals, because we already know that some families are at greater risk of cancer, some families are at greater risk of dementia. There's clearly a genetic component to how this stuff works, and as we understand more and more about it, I'd be really surprised if there isn't at least some degree of personalization.
Absolutely. And that kind of goes hand in hand with our ability to understand our genetics and kind of understand, what we're at risk for, and, early, detection and things like that. All these things are, it's not just the therapeutic side. It's also going to be this diagnostic side that will play a big part, right? And understanding I'm at risk for cancer at 20. Let's get me, better, diagnostics and, understanding of if I have cancer at 20 versus waiting until, 40, 50, 60. So I just wanted to throw all that stuff in there because I do, I personally believe that longevity is not, just the geroscience, right? I think that's probably the biggest part in my mind. I would say you probably agree too, but there's all these other industries and, efforts in the biomedical and biodiagnostic, landscapes that are going to play a big part in keeping people alive for a lot longer, right? And healthier. So, and senologist, is that a word that you just made up right now, or is that?
I think it might be a word I made up when I was writing the book, but yeah, it's not yet a thing.
All right. I like it. Nice. All right. So let's kind of get into some of the policy stuff. Specifically, let's talk about funding, because that's, what one of the biggest things that we advocate for here at A4LI, I mentioned it in the beginning, but the misallocation of funds based on what we die from is, it's wrong almost in a way. And it's not anybody's fault. It's no politician's fault. It's no one's fault. It's not any administration or country's fault. People just don't know. This is a new field, right? That people like you and me are, we're trying to bang on the doors and get people to realize, but it's still a very new field, right? So that's the first thing I kind of want to just throw out there before talking about how misallocated the funds are. So can you kind of give some statistics and discuss specifically like why you see the NIH's budget being so wrong? Like, what would be an appropriate number for you? And also, can you kind of touch on what's going on in the UK with the longevity space and specifically funding there? Like, is this a US specific issue, or is this, globally, are there other, countries that are kind of taking the lead on this effort?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a very hard one, because if you think about, if you're a politician, you're thinking about what have my friends or my relatives died of. Biden recently put his name to this cancer moonshot. Of course, friends, relatives, they die of specific diseases. That's what we write on death certificates. And I think this paradigm of imagining aging, which, is a natural process. And a lot of us, it's something that we aspire to. We want to live a sort of long, healthy life and become, wrinkled and grey haired and distinguished. These are not necessarily bad things. To imagine that there is some biological aging process that gave rise to that cancer, and that's the place you should intervene, I think is hugely counterintuitive. And this isn't just to, policymakers, people setting funding amounts. It's to doctors, it's to scientists, as I've already mentioned. This is just a whole new way of thinking about how we do medicine. So, as you say, absolutely no one's to blame for this, really. That said, there is a huge disparity in the funding compared to the potential for this field. And if we look at the NIH specifically, I think its overall budget is somewhere in the ballpark of $40 billion a year. But of that, about $2.5 billion goes to the National Institute on Aging. But unfortunately, it's even worse than that, because there's this sort of running joke in biogerontology that NIA doesn't stand for National Institute on Aging, it stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's Disease. And that's because about 2/3 of the funding goes to the Division of Neuroscience, which is looking essentially into Alzheimer's, dementia, and a few other forms of dementia. Now, this is hugely important work, because obviously dementia is a hugely important disease. But then if you drill down, there are a couple of other divisions in the NIA. There's some stuff looking at sort of the social aspects of getting older and some other parts of the biology. But the so-called aging biology division gets, I think, about $350 million a year. That's a bit over $1 per American. And you already mentioned, the causes of death. If you look at things like the cancer, the heart disease, the dementia, all of these things that aging causes, actually it's about 85% of deaths in the US are caused by aging. That 70% number is the global number. So that includes, less wealthy countries as well. In some rich countries, over 90% of deaths are caused by aging, essentially.
Right.
And yet it's receiving, this tiny, tiny fraction of the research funding. And then if you look at the US healthcare spending, then healthcare costs about 4 trillion. It's more than 4 trillion, I think, for the entire country. And so you're spending something like a 10,000th as much on trying to prevent the diseases of aging, which are responsible for a huge fraction of that healthcare spending, as you are on the spending itself. So that's, even from an economic standpoint, even if you're being a completely cold hard numbers guy, then this doesn't make any sense. And obviously, when you think about the human cost of these diseases, it's absolutely wild. And if there's something that's got an 85-90% chance of being the end of my life, I want to spend more than $1 a year trying to sort it out. So there's huge potential there for ramping up the funding and massively changing the research landscape.
So what do you think? What do you think a good number is? $10 a person? 100?
I mean, I'd be very happy to invest $10. I think, honestly, the limit for the number should be based on how fast can we scale this thing up. Because I'd happily give $100 a year for researching something that's almost certain to be the end of my life. I don't really know where the limit is. Certainly far, far higher than we are at the moment. So I think the real question is, to what extent, there are limits to how fast you can increase this budget. We can't triple it overnight, because where would the scientists come from? People have got to, move between disciplines. People have got to learn the tools of the trade in this new field. And so as a result, I think the real question is, what are the limits to scaling it up? And that's where I'd start the discussion for how high should we be aiming.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of efforts to kind of bring scientists from other disciplines into this aging biology field that I see crop up now. And, I feel like the infrastructure is kind of being set for that. But yeah, like you said, I was speaking with an office the other day, and sometimes if the Congress gives money to a certain agency and they can't spend the money, they'll say, don't give me this money, we don't want it, right? Like, or we can't take it, right? There's nothing to spend money on. And sometimes they'll force it on them anyways, and sometimes they won't. But I think if if it was me, 1,000, maybe 10,000.
Yeah, like it's so high that it's just completely out of proportion to where we are now. And so that's not really the question.
But like, if every person gave $10,000 or put 10,000 or wanted to put $10,000 of their money or whatever it is towards this, or of taxpayer, whatever we want to say, government money. I don't know if the NIA would be able to, it's something that I think this field needs to, like you said, it needs to be scalable, and it needs to be kind of, it needs to follow the trajectory of what's going on. The private and public need to kind of be working together, right? And I think that's really an interesting way to put this, though. I'm definitely going to praise the NIA Division of Aging Biology's budget like that. $1 per American. I like that. It's a lot more visual. It's a lot more visual. I do like that. So
yeah, definitely. And I think to sort of put a bit of more of an optimistic spin on how fast can we scale it up, the good news is that the tools of biology are relatively universal. Like, if you're working in a cancer research lab, and we know that the National Institute for Cancer gets about 2 to 3 times as much money as the whole National Institute for Aging, then those cancer researchers working in that institute, they already know all about how to use pipette, how to do complex microscopy, how to do DNA sequencing. All of the tools of modern science are largely transferable between those two domains. Obviously, they're going to have to learn, some new sort of terminology, some new paradigms in how they approach their research. But these aren't going to require decades and decades of retraining. These are some very smart scientists. And what will happen is, I think this is certainly the case in the scientists I've observed, they follow the money. Like, if there is a research grant that's available that means you need to turn your skills to researching aging biology, I think that firstly, they'll follow that money. And secondly, the case is so compelling. I think a lot of scientists would be motivated to work on it if they realize, a lot of those scientists who are working on cancer are doing so because they had a relative who died of cancer, or because they've got a sort of broader humanitarian imperative. So I think there's a huge potential there to bring scientists in from other fields, not just from cancer research, but all across biology, across some of the physical sciences as well. Like, that's obviously what happened to me. So there's huge potential to scale this stuff up. It's not as though we're super limited, but absolutely. I think that's the way we should be thinking about it.
Computer science, AI, all that, working with big data, all that stuff, right? Absolutely. You're definitely not wrong about that. Yeah. Money talks, and what's the rest of that saying? I forget. But yeah, money talks. We'll just leave it at that. I think we made a compelling case here for why the NIA Division of Aging Biology needs some more money. So thank you for that. Made my job a little easier there. I wanted to touch on the second part of that question, though, that I asked, which is, is this a universal issue, or is there any country that's really taking the lead on this that you see? What's it like in the UK? Is it similar to the US? And what can we kind of make from the landscape of how governments are putting money towards this longevity and biology of aging effort?
Yeah, I think there isn't really, a shining light to point to anywhere around the world. And in fact, it's quite challenging. One of the reasons I like talking about the US, firstly, is one of the largest, if not the largest researcher in the world, huge amounts of government funding, huge economy to sort of power that research machine. But also because it's, as far as I'm aware, the only, or certainly one of very few countries that has a National Institute for Aging, that has a government department or government body specifically devoted to funding aging biology research. In the UK, we've got nothing that's even sort of slightly similar to that. And that means that it's actually very, very hard to work out how much the UK spends on aging biology. I think this is a broader problem, across countries, across the world. You were sort of saying earlier, this sort of cost benefit analysis we should be doing. We should be, to some extent, looking at what causes the most death in the world, what causes the most suffering, and where could we have the most bang for our research buck. And the thing that makes this really, really hard is that no governments have a great sort of audit, and it's very dry, it's very boring, it's a sort of dull policy thing. But having an audit of where that research money goes, because if you look at something like the National Cancer Institute, it's a great thing to say, got this headline number, this is how much the US spends on cancer research. But actually, some of the money that the National Cancer Institute spends goes on basic science, understanding the cell biology. Now, this is super important because if we don't understand the cell biology, we can't understand how that cell biology then goes on to influence cancer. We've got sort of unknown unknowns. We don't realize cells do certain things, so we don't know to investigate them from a disease perspective. But at the same time, we don't really know where all of that money is going. And that means that it's very, very hard for governments to try and, nudge scientists in the direction of doing the most important research. And scientists often, they're very, very clever, they're smart people. That's how they got that job. And so they're very able to write their research grant in such a way as to fit a particular agenda. That isn't to say that all money in science is being wasted. I, of course, think it's hugely important. But you've got to be very, very careful trying to work out how that money is being spent, how to incentivize scientists to put their research effort where the biggest bang for the buck will be, rather than where the most interesting problems are. Because I'm as guilty of this as anybody. If there's a fascinating problem, you'll just follow that problem because it's just something that really gets your brain buzzing in the right particular way. So that's the challenge. And so I've asked government bodies in the UK, how much are we spending on aging biology? They don't really know. I've asked charities like the Wellcome Trust, and again, they don't really know. The figures that I've got for UK science funding have all been for specific diseases, and they're often produced by campaigning organisations rather than by government bodies. Because, for example, there was a great report that was produced, and it's quite a number of years ago now. I think it's almost a decade out of date, this number. But it was produced by an Alzheimer's charity trying to make the case that dementia was being underfunded compared to the scale of its impact. And this is a very valid case to make. It's receiving far less money than something like cancer or something like heart disease. But that meant that they therefore had to go through and look at the research funding for those various different conditions. So if essentially some academics commissioned by a charity is where I got my research funding numbers from. And that's just wild to me. The government's doling out these huge amounts of money, but they're not checking where it's going. And that isn't to say it's being wasted, but it makes it very, very hard to audit, to understand how much money is going toward the stuff that's most important.
Yeah. That's one of the big, I'll just say that's one of the big pushbacks for more funding, right? In the Republican controlled Congress right now, that's one of the big things that they're kind of worried about is, where is the money at the NIH and NIA and all that, maybe not specifically NIA by name, but the NIH, where's all that money actually going to, what research and things like that. And, you could get into some rabbit holes there that I definitely don't want to get into. So, but it is a valid concern, right? And also it's not even, to say that the money is being mismanaged in any way. You need to have an understanding of, what is actually being done in order to, figure out what is happening and just have a better understanding of the medical field and what people are applying for, and and then from that you can incentivize people to do the highest leverage science. And it's shocking to me that also there's so much, the government's so big, and there's, at least in the US, it's so big, and there is very little oversight on what's being actually spent. So an audit might sound a little boring though, so I don't know if we can get people excited.
Yeah, you're going to have to come up with a slightly sexier name for it. I think what's really important as well is just to emphasize the importance of that basic science. Because another thing that this audit, let's park that name for the moment, but another thing this audit could do is like to cut to set aside some money for that basic science, because it's so important. If we're going to discover these hallmarks of aging, we've heard they all relate to particular parts of the cell, and we need to know what those parts of the cells are. We need to know what the molecules are doing inside. We need to develop the new measurement techniques, the new kinds of microscope. These things might not have any obvious direct application, but it'll be so sad if in 30 years time we need a new kind of microscope that simply doesn't exist because we've put all of our money in this sort of laser focused R&D on specific problems that we can solve in the here and now. So I think that's another benefit of it, is it allows us to have that conversation and allows us to specifically ring fence some money just for scientists trying stuff out, because historically a huge amount of innovation has come from scientists just having random ideas and seeing where they lead.
Right. Well, leading to that kind of thought, you touched on Biden's effort with ARPA-H. It's just got started up in the past year or so, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on it from a because really I think the ARPA model allows scientists more than, and when you're applying for a government grant, right, you have to kind of fit the narrative that they're pushing. The biology of aging, or any longevity science is not really. Doesn't really fit the mold of what's getting money, usually in the U.S. government's grant giving system. And so my point is, ARPA-H is where experimental science is kind of done historically, at least in terms of DARPA, right? That's kind of been the case. So what do you think about ARPA-H? Like, and more specifically, like, how do you think we can convince the Biden campaign or the people that Biden has put in the campaign administration? Let me take that part out. The Biden administration, or the people that he's put in charge of ARPA-H, to make this longevity focused instead of strictly cancer focused, or how can we kind of marry the two, his vision with what the longevity community wants? How do you see that all kind of playing out?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is one of the really cool things about US research generally is that you are willing to take these big moonshots. The cancer moonshot's obviously one example. The literal moonshot is obviously another great example where, back in the 1960s. But even Operation Warp Speed during COVID, the government just, basically opened up the coffers and said, look, there's this huge amount of money, get this thing done as fast as possible. And that's a really, amazing thing that's not seen in many research systems around the world. So I think the first thing to say is this moonshot model, I would love to see a moonshot for aging. In terms of the cancer moonshot specifically, I really think we've just got this sort of communications job that we both know and are both trying to do, is to say, look, this cancer, we're intervening at the wrong time with so many diseases, and cancer by and large is one of them. The single biggest risk factor for cancer isn't smoking, isn't lack of exercise, isn't eating badly. It's simply being old. Like most people who are diagnosed with cancer are done, it happens in their 60s, it happens in their 70s, it happens in their 80s. Cancer gets exponentially more likely as the years pass through your life. And what that means is that by understanding the changes in our biology that happen as we get older, we can fundamentally we can defer a lot of those cancers from happening, which is so much better than trying to tackle them when they arise. Because firstly, chemotherapy, surgery, radiotherapy, these are grueling treatments. That isn't to say they haven't saved huge numbers of lives and they're better than the alternative, but they're very hard for patients. They're very hard for the patients' families. And also, we're intervening very late, which means you're battering someone with these chemo drugs at a point where they're already old and frail potentially. They've got loads of other comorbidities, they're called, these other diseases that they've got at the same time. And so they've probably got a bit of heart disease, they've got a bit of cognitive decline. That chemotherapy is only going to accelerate that decline. Whereas if we can intervene earlier, we can stop people from getting cancer in the first place. That's just so much more powerful than intervening at the very last minute, as medicine does at the moment. So I think in terms of convincing people who are working on what's currently sort of quote unquote normal medical research, it's the idea that preventative medicine, I think we're starting to understand more and more is so important, but just the huge benefits of intervening earlier in a body that's less aged and a body that's less frail, and then preventing those diseases from happening. I think, it'll be a perfectly valid way to spend money on a moonshot for cancer to try and prevent the cancer from happening in the first place.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And that's something I try to make everybody understand, that, a drug that targets aging is a drug for cancer, and it's also a drug for heart disease, and it's a drug for, diabetes and all these diseases, because, the ultimate goal is to prevent any of these from happening, right? So by targeting the biology of aging. So yeah. And also hear that everybody, cancer does not, you can eat and drink and smoke all you want, and cancer, aging is still, no, I'm just joking. It's a complete joke. Well, but you saying that does, the reason I wanted to say that is because that does kind of bring up another question that I hear all the time. how much can you do right now? And the fact of the matter is, from what I see, there's a lot of what we can do right now for our own longevity is, don't eat too much, don't drink too much, don't smoke, exercise, things like that. And it's a little bit depressing because people want a more exciting answer than that, but it's like there are some people who are experimenting with maybe rapamycin or metformin, but there's nothing that you can really point to and say, hey, do this, other than eat well, sleep well, don't drink that much, don't smoke, exercise, all that kind of stuff. So how do you, when people ask you that, what do you usually say? Like, what can I do right now, Andrew? What do you usually say?
Well, there's a few different things. The first is that I think understanding the aging biology actually makes these things a lot more compelling. So firstly, not smoking doesn't sound particularly sexy. But when you realize that smoking essentially accelerates the aging process, and therefore by quitting, you're decelerating not just, the effect on your lungs, they bear the brunt of the damage from smoking, of course, because that's where the smoke and, all these other gases are just going. But it also reduces your risk of cancer outside of the lung. It reduces your risk of heart disease. It reduces your risk of a whole range of unconnected things, even dementia. The same is true of exercise. You can feel as you're going for a run, your heart's pumping in your chest, your lungs are going. You can feel the benefit to your cardiovascular system, to your muscles. But again, it reduces the risk of some kinds of cancer, reduces the risk of dementia. It's not a perfect analog, but it's very, very close to literally slowing down the aging process. And that's really inspired me to sort of stick to this more basic health advice. The other thing that I think is really cool, you talked about rapamycin, metformin. We've already talked about senolytics as well. Some of these breakthroughs aren't decades into the future. They are, going to be with us in the next few years. And particularly if we can get some research money to actually do the trials and work out whether these things work. Mm-hmm. And what that means is if you're living healthy, if you're, trying to stick to your diet, trying to stick to your exercise schedule, it's very hard to be perfect with these things. But if you can, improve your healthy longevity that little bit, that means you might live long enough to be lucky enough to experience some of these first longevity breakthroughs. And if you can experience, take your rapamycin or metformin or senolytics, if those turn out to work, then what you can do then is live a little bit longer still and benefit from the next generation, the more advanced anti-aging therapies that are coming down the line. So there's just this huge incentive to stick to the quote unquote boring health advice, because as it slows down your aging, it makes you eligible for more and more of these exciting future developments. And the final thing that I'd say, the sort of most unconventional bit of health advice, and I know that I'm preaching to the converse with you, Dylan, but the fact is, the single most important piece of health advice, if you're sticking to basically a healthy diet, getting a bit of exercise, not smoking, getting enough sleep, doing all the sort of standard stuff, is to raise the profile of aging biology. Because this has such a huge potential to increase how long all of us live, how healthily, most important, all of us live. Not just for you, but for your friends, your family, for everyone you care about, for people you don't know, all around the US, all around the world. The single most important thing we can do is accelerate the development of these treatments so they arrive in time for the less healthy and the older of us. And I really think that's the single biggest thing we can do to move the needle. Because the fact is, all this health advice, you cannot exercise your way reliably to 100. Even if you follow every single tip in my book and every book, every good book on longevity you've ever read, then you are not going to guarantee that you make it into those sort of rarefied 90 or 100 years old in good health. This is, there's still a huge element of luck, a bit of an element of genetics. And so the single biggest thing, as I say, is to just make sure that this aging biology research happens and we can try and open up those sort of healthy older years to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You just gave me some goosebumps, so you can't see me here, but I agree with you, and the reason why I jokingly said eat and drink up and whatever and smoke up is because obviously I was joking, but aging really is, compared to all of them, the number, it outweighs those other ones by substantial margin.
It's absolutely remarkable. I'm going to get this number slightly wrong probably because it's a while since I've read it, but I think having high blood pressure roughly doubles your risk of a heart attack, but being 80 rather than 40 multiplies it by, it's more than a factor of 10. It might even be as much as a factor of 50. I can't remember the number off the top of my head. It's remarkable how much of a difference being older makes versus, all the risk factors that we know. So yeah, it's very much about how old you are and try and do something about it.
I think I got this from David Sinclair, but the analogy I use is like a CD, right? If you run a CD through a record player over 100 years, there are going to be scratches from wear and tear. Smoking is like taking it out and put an extra line on it. Mm-hmm. And exercising and sleeping well is like taking the disc out for a second and scratching, removing a scratch, right? And so you're not going to be able to exercise and sleep well enough over to remove all the scratches if it's going for too long, right? But that's where a longevity drug comes in, and you can get rid of a lot of those scratches kind of at once instead of, removing one at a time in the way
Yeah,
that's.
and I think the other inspiring thing about this health advice is all of it is cumulative. So if you're listening to this and you're, 60, 70 years old, it's never too late to start. I saw this amazing study while I was researching the book. I think it was some 90 something year olds who were given a 2 month long program of resistance exercise. So not pumping iron, but sort of effectively lifting weights, trying to put some strain on their muscles. And they found that their strength massively increased over that 2 month period and their walking speed improved. And you just look at a result like that and think, if someone in their 90s can manage that, then, there's basically no one listening to this. You can't, start integrating a 10-minute walk into your day, start taking those first steps. And actually those first steps are often the most valuable. And so, if you can reduce the sort of cumulative accumulation of those scratches on the CD to carry on with your analogy, it's never too late to start doing that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, living a really healthy and good lifestyle. And, I've seen this. My grandfather is 96, and I think part of it is genetics. But he has and always has prioritized living kind of that healthy lifestyle. And so over COVID, it kind of slowed down a little bit, right? And we encouraged him to kind of get back on his daily walks and all the things that he was doing before. And you could see that just by walking daily, right? He was just more energetic and alert and other places, right? And so yeah, the exercise really does have a lot of benefits. And I guess I gotta go pump some iron after this to get mine in for the day. So that was a great kind of discussion. Do you have any other thoughts on this kind of on what we were just talking about before? Because I do have one more topic I want to get to.
Let's crack on.
All right, cool. So the last thing I kind of want to touch on is, kind of demographics, right? And so, there's, a few things that play in world demographics, Western countries, Eastern countries, everywhere really, except for really the developing world. But, people are getting older, right? The population is going from, I think in the US, from 2020 to 2050, it's going from, I think, 13 to 25% of the population is going to be over to 65. So, we're going to see a 12% increase over the next 30 years. I think in Russia and in England, and I'm just thinking of the other ones I've looked at, France, it's all going to be even more profound. China too, it's going to be even more profound than the US, just because of, historical things that have led to that. But, the case I always make is that countries are kind of going to have no choice but to turn to longevity medicine to, lessen the burdens of this aging population, right? So, that's one aspect of it, but also, in terms of an economics, from the economic standpoint, people are having less children, right? The replacement, I think pretty much every country now is below replacement level that I can think of. So there are going to be less people to work, or less people who are able to work and contribute to the economy, right? And then more people who are going to require care. So can you kind of does it make sense to you? I would expect that it does, but would it make sense to you that longevity medicine would be kind of the ultimate antidote for this silver tsunami we're seeing? Like, do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's remarkable sort of the extent to which it's not discussed in policy circles. I listened to a podcast a while ago that was about this sort of demographic crisis in the UK. And, for the half hour, they spent a lot of time discussing, birth rates in different countries, a lot of time trying to work out how to incentivize women, particularly, to have more children, how to sort of spread the burden of parental care to try and make it a little bit easier, that kind of stuff. Not a minute was spent discussing trying to improve people's health at the end of life. And that's obviously, or the later part of life, which is obviously, even if only speculatively, it's a huge potential part of this. And, the reason being, if you think about something like retirement costs, the reason people retire often, historically, it was set up because people were unable to work anymore because they were physically incapable. Their health had deteriorated to that point. And then when we look at healthcare expenses, a huge fraction of that $4 trillion a year in the US is going on the chronic diseases of aging, the diabetes, the cancer, the dementia. These things don't kill you instantly. It's not like you just, go to sleep one night and then don't wake up the next morning. Often you suffer for years, you suffer for decades, you need social care, you need drugs. And then there's the indirect cost of these diseases as well, because, you might give up work because you're no longer capable of getting involved. You might withdraw from society. You're no longer contributing, spending money economically. You might have relatives and friends that do the same in order to look after you. So there's this huge sort of spiraling cost associated with the ill health of old age. But if we could help keep people healthier for longer, there's an enormous dividend to be made there, because people would be able to stay in the workforce a bit longer. People would be able to carry on doing their hobbies, seeing their grandkids, doing all of these things that are obviously great for their quality of life, but also great for the health of the economy. And in fact, if you sort of run through the numbers, there was a great paper that came out by Andrew Scott, who's an economist from the UK, and a couple of other authors. And they calculated the benefit to the US, like the amount that people effectively would be willing to pay for a delay of aging by just a single year. So if we could defer those diseases, increase lifespan just by 12 months, would be $38 trillion. And if you think about that in the context of GDP, of anything else, these are just, eye-wateringly enormous amounts of money that people really want to live healthier for longer. And this benefit effectively scales linearly. So if you extend that out to 10 extra years of healthy life, in their model, I think they got 367, again, trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. So people, the longer and the healthier that they can live, the more benefit they can get from life, the more they can contribute to the economy, the less they cost the healthcare system, and so on. So I really think it's kind of remarkable how little attention is paid to this. Another example, actually, is if I think we need to do some serious modeling of this stuff. And again, this is another sort of boring, dry sounding suggestion. But if you look at the United Nations is a body that does population projections around the world. There's also the Institute for Healthcare Metrics and Evaluation, who are doing all kinds of stuff about that. If you look at their population projections, they often have different variations of these population projections. They have so the UN, for example, has a high variant, a medium variant, and a low variant. And you ask what the difference is between those population projections. It's all birth rate. It's literally how many kids women are having. It's how many kids, how fast they're able to sort of roll out women's education, or access to family planning in the developing world are huge factors in this. And then if you delve down into the code and find out what's happening to life expectancy underneath all of these different scenarios, it's really sort of bizarrely short-sighted. It's unimaginative, because you see that countries, effectively, they imagine that life expectancy having been ticking up by 3 months a year, every single year, since the middle of the 1800s. So we've had almost 2 centuries of 3 months per year of life expectancy growth in the best performing country in the world. These bodies nonetheless assume that life expectancy is effectively going to plateau. And in many cases, they assume life expectancy is going to plateau below the levels that countries have already achieved in parts of the rich world. So, for example, the US life expectancy, when I looked into this, was projected to plateau at a level below where a country like Japan has already reached today. And this is, projecting all the way out to the year 2100. There may be problems with the US healthcare system, whatever those things might be. There are all kinds of, issues in societies around the world. But are they really saying that in 80 years' time, the US won't have improved to the point where countries have already made it today? It's incredible. And if you then look at countries in the developing world, the projection for Nigeria, which is obviously quite a poor country, never even made it to US levels today. And so you're just thinking, what is going to happen in Nigerian society that in the next sort of 50, 100 years, they're not going to be able to reach levels that we already know are humanly possible. So it's absolutely remarkable that these modelers aren't taking this stuff into account.
Oh my God.
That means that, your projections for pensions, your projections for all kinds of things are just going to be completely wrong if they're relying on these numbers. Even if current standards of medical care are rolled out around the world, we're going to see more than these increases. And if there's even the most modest of success in longevity science, we're going to, we could potentially see them completely blown out of the water. And actually, there's a classic paper called Broken Limits to Life Expectancy that looks back over historical projections of where life expectancy was going to plateau. And they found that these various projections, the average time from a limit being proposed to human life expectancy to it being exceeded in one country in the world was 5 years. So demographers really seem to have this natural pessimism about, how much further achievement we can have in medicine and healthcare and sanitation and all these various things. But actually, the most reliable indicator has been 3 months every year increased life expectancy. If you just draw that straight line, that has been, the simplest and best projection. And as I say, if we start getting improvements in longevity science, we could see that starting to take off even higher. So it's incredible to me how little attention is paid to this economically, demographically. And we really need, apart from anything else, just to start thinking about it. Because even if the funding doesn't increase, and I very much hope it will, but even then we've got stuff that, breakthroughs that are on the horizon. And that means it's incredible to me that we aren't thinking harder about this stuff.
I mean, so 80 years ago, the life expectancy in the US was what, 55?
Mm-hmm.
That's so ridiculous. That is crazy. That is nuts.
It is really incredible. So life expectancy has basically doubled since the middle of the 1800s. Life expectancy back then was sort of 30 or 40 years old. And now in most countries in the rich world, it's something like 80. I think Japan is currently leading the pack on 84 and a half years old or something like that. So we've really changed. We've effectively doubled what it means to be human. I think it's one of our greatest achievements as a species. And there's no reason to expect that progress won't continue.
Right, exactly. Even if even if it wasn't, I mean, I think everything is happening in, more of an exponential pattern than a linear pattern, right? Even if we had the same linear increase from, 80 years ago to now, which was about 30 years we got, right? 25 years. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's crazy. That's a really crazy. So the UN projects that by 2100, the US won't be above 84.5.
Exactly. And it's just like, on what possible medical social basis could you make that projection? It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Wow. All right. Well, yeah, I think I know what.
It's just hard to know where to start with it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I know. I like want to redo those UN numbers and take into account all of that, right? But what I was also thinking about is, you mentioned, obviously birth rates are low, right? And the governments are trying to get people to have more babies, which is a little weird if you ask me. But I kind of understand it, even though I believe they should be focusing on, keeping people alive who are alive now, alive for longer and in a healthier state. But another part about of longevity that's kind of not talked about as much, or talked about in some regards, but I think it's quite interesting because it does kind of help on that birth rate issue, right? Is the effort to help with female fertility, right? And I've seen efforts with male fertility too, but obviously that's they face different issues on that. But I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that's kind of an interesting mission there in of itself. I mean, obviously it's longevity related, right? But it's a specific part of longevity that affects, it affects obviously the birth rate, topic, but it also, I think, affects a little bit like, social dynamics and how people kind of live their lives. And, I'm 25 now, I've friends who are starting to get married here, right? And so it's like, this is the kind of time when people think about it and, there's a time for it, right? So it's just interesting because if, that window is extended, how do people kind of react to it and how does, society kind of built? But
and I think I'm 37 and I am very much in crunch time. A lot of my friends are, they're either they've got their partner and they're sort of, deciding, do we want kids or not? We've got to make the decision in the next few years. Right. Is my career at an inflection point? Should I be, working hard? And is that going to then mean that I make a decision that affects me for the rest of my life? Right. And so I think actually, treating reproductive aging, it's a feminist issue because we men, as you say, the issues are quite different for us. Men can continue reproducing certainly into their 50s, maybe their 60s, 70s. I think the oldest recorded father on record might have even been in his 90s, which is a bit of a strange thing in itself. But, nonetheless, we have a very different set of constraints. And that's part of the reason, why men and women have such different outcomes in the workplace at the moment.
Right.
So I think that's a hugely important thing. And actually, generally, women have often been neglected from medical research. So another thing that this sort of downstream consequence of this, women undergo menopause often in their 40s or 50s. Mm-hmm. And that dramatically changes their biology. And it can result in thinner bones. It can result in less muscle density. And these things, again, go on to have consequences for their aging. So that's another area in which we just need to understand those biological differences between men and women, between menopausal women and non-menopausal women, and try and work out how to keep women as healthy as possible, in optimal functioning condition for longer. Whether or not they're able to have children, that's almost a separate question. But carrying on that sort of premenopausal level of function postmenopausally is another huge, huge health issue. And I think one that's not getting enough attention, in aging biology or just in general.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm with you. It's something, there's a few companies out there that have raised a good amount of money that I've been aware of. And so, it's definitely something that people, it's something that, as it should be, people care about, but it's not something that I feel like many people in the industry kind of touch on a lot. So I'm glad we got to talk about that a little here. Yeah. So I think we're kind of coming up on time here. So the last kind of, thing I wanted to, the last topic or the last, discussion point I wanted to bring up is, I like to kind of get a sense of, why my guests do what they do, right? Like, what really inspired you to make this your passion? I know you talked about, you wanted to you switch from physics to biology to like actually verify if this was real, right? That was kind of your impetus. But for me, it was, really COVID is what drove me to, get involved in the biology of aging, right? And this, political effort that I'm undertaking. It was kind of watching my grandfather have to deal with, aging in a very, up in front way, and kind of watching him watch his friends and, people he cared about have to deal with COVID and pass away from it and things like that. And so that's what kind of, in a way almost traumatized me, and was like, I decided I needed to do something. Right. And so, and I've talked to people, and it's not everybody's like that. Not everybody has like a kind of, thing that kind of, they can like think back to, that some people are just scientists like through and through, and this is the field that they, got into. But what is it for you? Like, do you have something that really drives you in this field? And, if so, what is it?
I think COVID's a fantastic example, actually. It's something that I think is just worth mentioning quickly separately, which is that when we talk about pandemic policy, there's obviously this discussion of trying to develop the next vaccine for the next pandemic in 100 days and get mRNA technology such that we can roll it out as fast as possible. One of the best things we could do for the next pandemic is have medicines that slow down the aging process. Because why was it that those older people were so much more susceptible for COVID? At the end of the day, why did we have to shut society down? It was because older people were dying, potentially, or would have died had we not done that, in huge, huge numbers. And if we could all just be 10 years younger in our immune systems when the next pandemic comes along, that's a disease agnostic. It doesn't matter what sort of disease it is, we're going to be much more prepared for it. So I think that's the first thing just to sort of mention as an aside about COVID. In terms of my origin story, actually, and perhaps, my background as a physicist is the reason this was possible. I changed career essentially because of a graph. And that graph is the graph of your risk of death, depending on how long ago you were born. And I think it's just worth, all of us know that older people are more likely to die. That's something that we've been brought up with, as children. We understand that our grandparents are more frail, and we might even see them die in our childhood. But what's remarkable is just how much that change, what that change actually looks like in magnitude. So the safest age to be, and I think this is an incredible statistic, modern 10-year-olds are the safest humans in the history of our species, which is to say they've got a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of not making their 11th birthday. But unfortunately, after that, things, unfortunately go downhill from there. So I'm, as I said, 37. My odds of death this year are somewhere around 1 in 1,000. And I quite like those odds. Like, if that were to continue for the rest of my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. But clearly, that isn't what happens. And that just really illustrates, how low your risk of death is as a young adult. It's very, very hard to die, essentially. Cancer, heart disease, these things do happen. It's tragic, particularly tragic when it happens in younger people, but it's very, very rare. But then as you carry on through life, if I'm lucky enough to make it into my 90s, but unfortunate enough that we haven't had any developments in medical technology in the intervening time, my odds of death any given year will be 1 in 6. So that's life and death at the roll of a dice. And you look at those odds, and, as a human, it is a bit terrifying. But as a scientist, you look at it and you think, wow, what is it that's causing this synchronized increase and this exponential increase in the risk of death? And the causes of that death, the cancer, the heart disease, the strokes, the dementia, all of these diseases rapidly, rapidly increasing after your sort of 7th or 8th decade. It's, remarkable that perhaps we can understand this process and do something about it. And it might not be a coincidence that a lot of this was happening at the same time as my parents. They're getting into their late middle age now. I've just had my dad's mum finally passed away. So that was my last grandparent. And I sort of watched that process of deterioration. So there is a bit of a human element to it too. But ultimately, I think what really drove me was these statistics. Because as we've already actually mentioned this, as you run through the numbers, aging is responsible for more than 2/3 of deaths globally, probably more than 80%, more than 90% in a lot of rich countries. And when you think about, what those deaths involve, we've already said there are years or even decades of suffering. The treatments are often very grueling. These things are hard for you. They're hard for your friends, your family, watching you go through these diseases and the treatments for them. And I think it's probably inarguable that aging is the largest cause of suffering in the world as well, because it's, most people are going to be killed by it. And that death is preceded by, decades of disease, of decrepitude, of frailty, of, all these various different things. I just thought this is our biggest humanitarian challenge. And that's ultimately what drove me, from being a physicist to being a biologist, to then trying to raise the profile of this field and really, do something about what I think is our biggest cause of suffering. And therefore, because we have the science to do something about it, our biggest humanitarian opportunity to make a difference.
Yeah, the odds, it's pretty powerful. That's a pretty powerful one. So the last thing I kind of want to just ask you before we hop off here and send you on your way, and we go on our way here, what gives you hope for the future? Like, what gets you out of bed? I have a feeling it has something to do with the biology of aging field, if I had to guess, but maybe not. What would you say is, what like gives you hope for the future of, humanity, let's say?
I think in terms of the aging biology, it's the fact that we've got these 10 hallmarks now, however many you choose to say. And we've got multiple different treatment ideas for all of them. So if this was just something where we had one drug that delayed aging a bit in some animal, or, we had, maybe a couple of ideas for a couple of the hallmarks that might have been demonstrated, then, it'll be hard to get super excited. This would be an important thing to carry on doing research into, sure. But the fact that we've got multiple different, very different ideas for all of the hallmarks of aging, and the fact that these hallmarks seem to be connected together is something that's very exciting too. So the fact that, you can kill the senescent cells in a mouse and affect what seems to be the whole of its aging. And we know that that's because that senescent cell accumulation is linked to a whole bunch of other hallmarks. That means it will be wildly unlucky for none of this to work. Because say we've got 5 ideas per hallmark, we've got 50 different treatment ideas. And it might be that many of them affect most, perhaps even all of the aging process. How much bad luck would we need for literally none of those things to pan out? And so that's what really gets me excited about this field and the future. It's just that, we have to get super unlucky for none of this to work. And the potential, if it does work, is absolutely massive. So I think that's just makes it a very exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of shots on target, right? You got to think at least one, if not more, are going to make it in, right? A lot of really skilled shooters, to make the sports analogy complete, doing the science every day, you included. And so I'm grateful for you, for people like you, and for this, effort for existing, because, without it, I'd have nothing to advocate for. So,
well, I'm grateful for you guys for doing the advocacy, because I think that it's very easy as a scientist to stay sheltered in your lab all day, but actually, a huge amount of what happens is dictated by how the funding is done, by how the policy works, by making sure it's possible to get the drugs to market, all the really important stuff you're advocating for. So thank you.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. I think we're good to go, Andrew.
It's been a pleasure. Cheers.
Live long and prosper.
I want to thank Andrew Steele for making time to join us today. And those of you listening at home, I hope you found this conversation as enlightening and informative as I did. If you have anyone you would like to see make an appearance on our podcast, you can send your suggestions to us at info@a4li.org. HSpan will return in a couple of weeks, but until then, let's live long and prosper.